I hope all of you can understand me. I'll try to speak a little bit slowly. And I have a rather exciting topic for today, which is how to escape from middle income traps. Why are some countries trapped at middle income levels while others continue to forge ahead and reach high income levels? That will be the topic of today's discussion. On the next slide, you have some background literature, which I won't go through in detail, but I would like to mention one name in particular, which is our former PhD student Alejandro Lavopa, who did a very interesting thesis on structural transformation and development traps. And we also worked together jointly on this topic, and I used part of our joint working paper as material for this presentation. Okay, let's start by saying that the whole idea of a development trap is a fairly recent concept. If we go back in economic history, for instance, before the Middle Ages, all economies in the world were trapped at economic levels very close to subsistence. But as all economies were trapped, there was no awareness of traps. People accepted that escape from poverty was only temporary and cyclical and had rather fatalistic attitudes on survival. This changed somewhere around the 14th century when you had the economic breakthrough of Western Europe. And the result was 600 years of sustained growth in Western Europe and the so-called Western offshoots. There was a huge acceleration after the Industrial Revolution, and especially from 1820 onwards. And the interesting thing about this very long-run process of growth is that it contrasts with the earlier cyclical patterns of growth, where you had short periods of upward movement, and then countries and people would fall back to close to subsistence level. So what this breakthrough did is create a huge divergence and inequality in the global economy. Some regions remained at the same level, while a small number of countries tended to forge ahead. Well, without this experience of breakthrough, we wouldn't even have a concept of development, because it is the example of the Western breakthrough which showed that sustained improvements in per capita income were possible. Since 1870, several countries have been able to achieve catch-up, such as Russia, Germany, Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, Korea, and China. And in the course of the 20th century, development and catch-up became an explicit goal for the so-called developing countries. And once development and growth becomes a goal, then the opposite concept, of course, is a trap. Those countries that failed to achieve accelerated growth were seen as trapped. So it is this long-run experience of growth which creates the idea that development is a possibility. Well, once development is a possibility, then if you fail to develop, you are seen as trapped. Let's see. Now, in the literature, we distinguish two types of traps. First, poverty traps, countries that remain stuck at very low levels of per capita income, with the result that huge segments of their population suffer from absolute poverty. For instance, large percentage of the population with less than $1 a day. Okay? We're not going to talk about that today. What we are going to talk about are middle income traps. Countries in middle income traps are countries which have achieved a measure of growth and catch up. They have escaped from poverty traps and have increased their relative and their absolute income levels. And many of these countries are now at lower or upper middle income levels as defined by the World Bank. But these countries seem to be unable to achieve further rapid growth and catch up so as to graduate into upper income categories. And there are many, many examples of countries that have fallen into middle income traps. For instance, Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico in Latin America, South Africa in Africa, and Thailand and Malaysia in Asia. Now, these countries have attained quite high average per capita incomes, but they are also characterized by highly unequal distribution of incomes. So the percentage of the population which lives in poverty is much higher than one would expect on basis of GDP per capita. So what we're going to examine in the next hour is why so many countries remain trapped in these middle income traps. I want to share with you the notion of what I call the paradox of increased global inequality, but very rapid catch-up in selected countries. If you look at the long-run development of the global order since 1820, there has been a veritable explosion of income inequality. Imagine that around 1820, the richest to poorest country had a ratio of 2 to 1. Around 2012, high-income countries are 28 times as rich as the poorest countries. Or the very richest country is even 172 times as rich as the poorest country, the Democratic Republic of Congo. So a huge amount of inequality. But what is also strange is that in spite of the huge inequality, some countries succeed in moving from the bottom of the income ladder to the top in a little over 2 generations. Let's say a country like Korea in 1950 was poorer than Ghana. And today it's a high income economy. It's moved up through all the ranks of the income ladder to achieve a top place. And what we also see is that though the ladder has become much more unequal, the rates of catch-up since 1950 are much more rapid than in the 19th century. You can, for instance, say that countries which are catching up are now growing around 3 times as fast as the leader, the USA. While if you look at the 19th century, the catch-up countries were going at 1.5, perhaps almost 2%, 2 times as much as the leader, the United Kingdom. So in spite of the huge increase in inequality, you see that the speed of catch-up has increased. So again, the big question is, why do some countries fail to catch up? Why are they trapped? And why are other countries able to forge ahead? And again, to lift up one corner of the mystery, of course, the key difference has to do with absorptive capacities, the abilities of countries to tap into global technology. If you're able to do that, very rapid growth is possible, as knowledge flows much more easily in the modern economy than it did in the 19th century. So if you have created the right institutions, the right capabilities, then this fantastic rate of catch-up is possible. If not, you become trapped. Here, I hope you can see this table on the sheet. You need to look primarily at the most right-hand column, where you see how fast countries are growing compared to the leader in the 19th century, and then you can see it's between 1.3 and 2 times as fast. That's the catch-up rate in the 19th century. And then if you look from 1950 onwards, you see very high rates of catch-up. On many of the countries are growing at least 3 times as rapidly as the leader. So it's a very spectacular process. Somebody is asking if the slides will be available, and the answer is yes. So the conclusion is catch up is possible but not easy. There are many examples of catch up, but most countries remain trapped. And again, the key difference, I would argue, is absorptive capacity, the capacity to tap into global technology. The next table, which I will show in a moment, provides a first indication of how difficult it is for a country to change its income position. What I've done is that I've ranked all countries in 1950 by their relative income, and then done the same in 2015. We have 124 countries in this database, and you can divide the countries in quintiles in 1950 and quintiles in 2015, and then see how many of the countries have been able to change their relative income position. Well, you can see that dramatic change is very difficult. Only 8 of 124 countries were able to move upwards in the income distribution by more than 1 quintile. 77% of the countries were trapped at the same level, or even moved downwards. Nevertheless, one cannot say that the income ranking is frozen or fixed. There was a lot of mobility, with about 54% of the sample of countries experiencing upward or downward mobility. So now I'm moving to the table itself. I think it's self-evident. In the left-hand side, you see which countries are trapped in the bottom quintile, the second quintile, the third quintile, the fourth quintile, and the fifth quintile. And on the right-hand side, I've summarized it. 8 countries have moved up more than 1 quintile, 20 countries have moved up only 1 quintile, and the rest has been trapped or even declined. So a lot of countries are stuck, and a few countries succeed in forging ahead. And what we are trying to understand is, why is this the case? Why are some countries able to improve their relative position, and why are other countries stuck? That is the key issue today. I should be able to move to the next slide. Okay. Now let's briefly say, how are we going to define middle income traps empirically? And the empirical approach is to simply estimate the number of years a country has been stuck in a given income category, low middle income or upper middle income, and then we compare it with some benchmark for countries which have made the successful shift to a higher income category. And when the estimated number of years to move to another category is longer than this benchmark, then we define these countries as trapped. Well, first we had to define the income measure, which is gross national income per capita in 2005. Then we projected this backwards, and I will spare you the details. Those are in the working paper that I mentioned, all the way back to 1950. So then we get, in dollars of 2005, the same income categories over 65 years. Okay? Then we can calculate how many years each country of our sample has been classified, for instance, as a lower middle income country. And once we know this, we can calculate a definition of middle income traps. We take the average number of years needed to graduate by the upper quartile of the distribution by time to graduation of countries that have graduated to a higher income category between 1950 and 2013. I'm pretty sure you don't understand that sentence, so I'll try to phrase it in a different way. We only consider a country as trapped if it has been stuck in a given income category for more years than the slowest 25% of the countries that succeeded in escaping the trap. So we compare a country with the slow escapers who only just made it, And if they take longer than the slowest 25%, then we define them as trapped. So then we get the following thresholds, and this becomes a little bit easier again. For the upper middle income trap, if you're an upper middle income country for more than 31 years, you're trapped. If you're in the lower middle income category for more than 41 years, you're trapped. And for poverty, if you're a poor country for more than 27 years, you're defined as trapped. So this gives us a kind of an operational definition. Okay. Why are countries trapped? I'll say more about this later on. But many developing countries enter the global market for labor-intensive manufactured exports based on their advantage in low wage costs. Almost all the successful developers have done this, whether it's Korea, Taiwan, China, Indonesia. There's always this phase of labor-intensive manufacturing. Now, as a low-income country becomes richer, its competitive advantage in low labor cost becomes eroded. You can see, for instance, in China or in Indonesia, that wages are rapidly going up. Unions are bargaining for better wages, and the country loses its competitive edge in labor costs. So the only way then to forge ahead is to start competing with technological advanced economies based on productivity increases, innovation, and technological capabilities. Now, you're trapped if your wages start increasing too quickly to compete in the low-cost labor segment, while your technological capabilities don't develop fast enough to move ahead. One example, a typical example, is South Africa. You have, even though they still have enormous supplies of unskilled labor, unions are bargaining and asking for 15% wage increases, but the technological dynamism of the country is insufficient to compensate this increasing wage cost by innovation and increasing productivity. Well, a special case of middle income traps are the resource and oil-rich economies. Here, of course, we have the famous Dutch disease effect, where the wages in the non-resource sector become non-competitive and structural transformation of the economy phase. You know, it's so profitable to sell oil or diamonds, and the exchange rate depreciates, wages in other sectors go up, so these sectors become non-competitive, so you have a lack of structural change, and you see that many of these countries are trapped in upper middle income level. Now, what I'm going to talk on from now on is the topic of structural modernization. Countries are trapped if they have insufficient degree of structural modernization. In a joint paper with Alejandro Lavopa, we define development failures as the inability of the economic system to realize two simultaneous transformations. One is changes in the structure of the economy, and the other is technological catch-up. Okay, structural change, a key aspect of development, involves moving from low productivity to high productivity, high potential sectors. For instance, from agriculture to manufacturing. And traditionally, the dynamic sector was indeed the manufacturing sector, the engine of growth. But in the modern literature, we have come to realize that sometimes some of the service sectors, dynamic market service sectors, also have this same potential to be engines of growth. So we measure structural change as the increase in the share of labor in the more dynamic sectors of the economy, which we call modern market activities, or MMA. And here you see the simple equation where the share of labor in the modern sector is calculated as a percentage of labor in the total economy. The NM divided by the LT. Here you see briefly the definition of modern market activities. Basically, we take the whole of industry plus the dynamic sectors of services, which include transport, storage and communication, and finance, insurance and business services. And we leave out restaurants, we leave out the informal sector, we leave out agriculture, and also we leave out government, which in some ways is modern, but government is productivity resistant. There's only a limited extent to which we can increase the productivity of government, so we leave it out of modern market activities. Okay, so then we look at the share of labor in these so-called modern market sectors. Then the second dimension is technological upgrading, which can be measured in a great many ways, but there's a very simple one, simply to look at the gap in GDP per capita relative to the world leading economy, which is usually still the US. If this percentage, this productivity ratio is increasing, we have technological upgrading and technological catch-up. If not, we don't. So this is the row which looks at the productivity within the modern sector, PM, divided at productivity of the modern sector at the world frontier, which could be the US. Now, when you're talking about technological upgrading, and you have different types of upgrading and different types of catch-up. This is something which comes from a book by Keun Lee, also mentioned in my background literature. We have what you call path following catch-up, when the follower country simply imitates the path of the advanced economy. You have something which happens much more often, which is stage skipping. You do follow the same path, but you skip from a low level of technology to state-of-the-art technology, and thereby achieve fairly rapid growth. Stage skipping. And then you have a kind of catch-up which is based on leapfrogging. In a limited number of countries, you don't only imitate, but you start innovating at the frontier in selected industries. And examples of leapfrogging, of course, include Korea and China at the moment. It is typically no longer imitating or skipping. It is actually, in some sectors, innovating at the global frontier. Okay, now you get a very simple index at the bottom of the sheet, the omega, which is the product of these two indexes, lambda and rho. The share of the share of employment in the modern sector and the distance to the US. And this is what it looks like. If you look at these lines, that's the interesting thing. I don't know if you can see my arrow moving, but you can see a given level of modernization, let's say omega 1, which can be achieved either by having a lot of labor in the modern sector, but a low level of technological capabilities, or you can have a small modern sector, but very high capabilities in the modern sector. So you have a kind of trade-off. There are different ways in achieving a given level of structural modernization. You can see, I'm glad you can see the arrow moving. Thank you. Now, if you want to move from omega 1 to omega 2, the second level of structural modernization, you can see that you can do it in different ways. You can again try to increase the percentage of your workers in the modern sector, but you can see that you're running into diminishing returns. The further you go to the left, the larger the increase has to be. So it's becoming more difficult. The same thing you can see if you choose for technological upgrading. If at any given level of structural change you want to modernize, you have to, at this point, you already have to go a long way, and if you go here, it almost becomes infinite. So if you are far away from the middle of this figure, you're in trouble. You have to do an awful lot to still move ahead. And of course, it's easier to move from one level to another if you are both increasing the share of the modern sector and upgrading, so you sort of move along this dotted line. Okay, this is what we call the structural modernization landscape. Now, we can use this to show how countries can be trapped. You can see that if you are below a given level of your structural modernization index, then you will find typically countries which are trapped, because we argue that the structural modernization is a condition for moving upwards. So here you see a lot of the countries which are trapped because they haven't achieved this level of structural modernization. Here you can see sort of upper left-hand area 3A, you can see countries which are trapped at upper middle income countries because they haven't achieved sufficient structural modernization to move all the way to sector 4, which is the high income level. So this gives you an idea how we combine income levels and modernization index to analyze trapped countries. Okay, so here you see a few of the figures. The threshold levels of omega needed to move upwards. It follows that a common feature shared by almost every country that we have identified as trapped is that they've been unable to achieve sufficient structural modernization. Now, I'm going to move on quickly because I want to spend some time on explanations, and time is always limited, but you can also use this map as a kind of trajectory. So for instance, you see Korea, I hope you can all see it. You can see that in the beginning it is simply increasing the share of labor in the modern sector, but then more or less parallel to the 45-degree line, it is both increasing the share and increasing the technological capabilities till around 1990. Then it goes even further in its technological capabilities, while its modern sector even becomes marginally smaller. Taiwan has a slightly different trajectory in a way that it's steeper, there's more increase in the size, and then suddenly you have a very dramatic increase in technological capabilities, but also a reversal. So this is when the problems start. It is moving backward in terms of structural modernization. China, another famous case. In the beginning, it's all quantity. You simply increase the size of the modern sector without increasing its relative productivity levels. And then suddenly, you start innovating very rapidly, moving to the right, and thereby, in a very short period of time, shifting from a poor country to an upper middle income country. And if we would add the latest figures, they're on the verge of becoming a high income country. Okay, let's take now two sadder examples where you see a typical trapped country, Brazil, which achieved quite a lot from 1960 to 1980, but then its technological capabilities declined so that it remained stuck at an upper middle income country. Exactly the same pattern you see in South Africa. You see an increase till 75, 80, and then a decline in terms of technological capabilities. So we have these trajectories for each of the 124 countries, and each of them tells an interesting story. Okay, now let us start talking a little bit about explanations. On the one hand, we have a set of effects which we can call supply side effects. These are a series of factors which affect the technological capabilities of the countries and thus the supply side of the economy. Let's take, for instance, domestic efforts in R&D. You can see that China has moved close to the European average of 2% of GDP. The national capabilities to absorb foreign technology, the scope for imitation and diffusion of technology. It is clear that escape from development traps requires a total, single-minded and concentrated focus on technological upgrading on part of both firms and public policy makers. And typical examples of this are Korea and China. China is a country which is escaping the middle income trap as we speak by hugely increasing both the quantity and the quality of its investment in R&D, its patenting activity, its ability to learn from multinationals, etc., etc. Huge investments in their university system, the quality and quantity, a huge willingness to learn from other countries by sending out students all over the world, as Japan did in the late 19th century after the Meiji Revolution. Then we have demand side effects. Think of the terms of trade. Think of a country like Brazil, which suffered from improving terms of trade, but also appreciation of the currency due to its primary exports, thereby making its manufacturing sector non-competitive. You also look at the composition of exports, because some exports have much higher income elasticity than others. We also look at the macroeconomic environment, the stability of domestic demand. A second aspect, or third, I think it should be the third aspect, sorry for that, has to do with the composition of structural change. Till now, we looked at structural change as one dimension and technological upgrading as a second dimension, allowing us to make these beautiful landscape maps. But of course, the composition of structural change itself is related to technology, because some sectors are much more technologically dynamic than others. So if you succeed not only in increasing the share of labor in the modern sector, but the share of labor in specific parts of the modern sector, then of course you automatically not only increase the size of the modern sector, but also move to the right in the landscape by reducing the productivity gap. So the structural composition of the modern sector itself will definitely affect the size of the aggregate technology gap of the modern sector. Now I'm going to move to a slightly different literature, which is sort of fathered by a guy called Lee, who wrote a very interesting book in 2013, which focuses on how to achieve technological upgrading, which in our scheme is the movement to the right. And he says that if you want to escape any kind of middle income trap, I'm just reminded we have only 10 minutes left. I'll be able to finish by that time, no problem. So Lee says, let us focus on a kind of technologies which he calls short cycle technologies. That is, technologies which only cite patents which are very recent. Why is that? If you have a technology which cites patents which were developed 20, 30, 40 years ago, long cycle technologies, then this is very mature technology. And it's almost impossible to compete with established firms and established countries. They have the knowledge base to do this best. But if you have a technology which builds on something which was developed yesterday, then the incumbents don't have much advantages. You know, it's so recent, they haven't built up an advantage here. So these are the technologies which will allow the new countries to rapidly technologically upgrade. And currently really offers some interesting evidence that it is indeed these short cycle technologies which allow leapfrogging or huge jumps, stage skipping. For instance, in communication technology, the rise of nanotechnology, the shift from mainframes to laptop computers, or the emergence of cloud computing. Now, the ability to enter these new technological areas, these short cycle technologies, depends even more than ever on the development of technological capabilities, on research capacity, on higher and more creative levels of human capital. Human capital becomes more important than ever for escaping middle income traps. Now I'm coming close to my last slides with a few concluding remarks. Let me see. Yeah, two more. A common pattern in so-called trapped economies is that political economy factors and populist policies have not allowed countries to fully exploit the labor-intensive phase of catch-up, in which there is a rapid expansion of the modern sector without much technological upgrading. For instance, in Africa, there are unbelievable reserves of labor, but nobody is entering manufacturing because wages are relatively high. Why? Because the unions and the governments have a sort of a cozy relationship to protect a small elite which is in the modern sector, keeping outside all other people. Why is it that Bangladesh has built now, in the past 10 years, a textile industry employing 6 million people? Or Vietnam? Why is it not happening in Africa? Well, for this you need political economy explanations. It's also very true for Latin America, where the increases in wages preceded technological catch-up, so that the cost advantages were eroded well before technological upgrading kicked in to create competitive advantage. Okay? Now, the first argument is that if wage increases had been slower, this would give countries more breathing space to achieve technological upgrading. It would simply buy them more time. In itself, it would not solve everything, because after building up a large modern sector, you have to start on this upgrading process. And this is where the second main observation comes in, that what we see within the modern sectors of trapped economies is a very dualistic structure, with a small number of very modern firms which can compete at the global frontier, but also huge numbers of technologically backward firms with what is called a missing middle. There's not so much in between. Now, you can interpret this as a weakness of national systems of innovation, a concept with which most of you must be familiar. The national systems of innovation are not very effective because technological knowledge does not flow easily from the most modern firms to other firms in the economy. And this slows down the average process of upgrading. Something else is happening. Productivity differentials within the modern sector are increasing rather than decreasing, because the knowledge which is available in the state-of-the-art firms is not shared, is not diffusing, is not flowing towards the other firms. And that keeps down technological upgrading and keeps countries trapped. And what you need is, to escape this trap, is a total assault on weak innovation systems through education, through increased public R&D, through increased firm level R&D, but also creating the connections between firms which allow the smaller and more backward firms to sort of catch up with the state-of-the-art firms. If that could be achieved, then we would be on the way to escaping from the middle income trap. And with that, I'd like to finish this presentation and open the floor for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this very interesting presentation. It's interesting because it complements the discussion we had in our first webinar about complexity. And I would like to open the floor for anyone who wants to ask a question right now. So feel free to ask them. Well, if anyone's gonna ask, I'm gonna. Well, Daniel, please. If you have one question, please, you can use your microphone. If you...
Yes. Hello. Thank you very much for this presentation. It was really interesting. My question has to do with the issue of measurement of the productivity gap, which is one of the two elements that you use to categorize the trap. And my question is I know that every methodology has its issues and everything, but I was wondering, for example, in the case of Mexico, because in paper it has a relatively modern economy, specialized on technology, on highly specialized technology, but actually it's not the case. It's just most of the value added is actually imports that are just put there by global value-added chains that are part of NAFTA and all of these things, and then re-exported to the U.S. But actually, the value-added that Mexico provides, it's really small, which then translates into this issue that Mexican firms have a very limited capacity in terms of innovation because of this issue. So, to what extent you discuss this issue in your paper and in your research? The impact of global value-added chains into this discussion?
Thank you. That's a good question, and I'm happy to say that I'm supervising a PhD on the Mexican maquiladora, which should be finished in April, which deals with exactly this topic. Let's go in two directions. First, as far as measurement is concerned, it is fairly simple. You can measure value added per worker in the Mexican export sector or the Mexican domestic sector, and you can simply compare it with the US, and you will find that Mexican production is much more labor intensive and that there is a huge productivity gap. It is also true what you say, that a lot of value added is not captured by Mexicans, because they actually, what happens is that American firms send their intermediate inputs to Mexico where they are assembled. Sometimes, this is one of our latest findings, the American firms first send their raw materials to China, where the intermediates are created. The intermediates are then exported to Mexico, where they're assembled and exported back to the US. However, we do see that there is a measure of dynamism in the maquiladora sector, and that actually productivity is not stagnant. And over time, there is a fairly respectable growth of productivity, both in the domestic Mexican economy, and the question is, how could you do more? And this requires very strong and comprehensive policy, where you think of moving upwards in the global value chain. In order to move up, you first have to move in. And Mexico has been unbelievably successful in moving in there. And I think In terms of employment, millions of jobs have been created, and there has been a positive contribution to the Mexican economy. And now that Donald Trump is trying to abolish all this, we are suddenly waking up and finding out how positive it has been. But going back to your question, more could have been done, and Mexico has been relatively unsuccessful in radical upgrading, and there, of course, a more systematic policy would have been good, because there's a built-in inconsistency that in order to qualify for maquiladora support, you have to process imported intermediates, which means per definition you're focusing on assembly. And if they would broaden the idea that you could also process domestic intermediate inputs, this would be one way of capturing more. Now actually, since 2006, Mexico has been doing that, because the maquiladora has been broadened to include something called IMEX, which also includes firms that process domestic inputs. But still, I think it's a very good and relevant question, and I've tried to respond as well as I can.
Professor, we have another question here from Fernando Sosdorf. What policies or measures do you suggest to overcome the problem of structural heterogeneity in the modern sector? And I would like also to state a question here. Do you believe that the regional dynamics among distinct countries also affect their possibilities of catching up? Not only individual countries by itself, but there is a regional dynamic, such as, for instance, the idea of the flying geese, that can become a way of regionally catching up to the frontier. And sorry, I have another question as well here from Weed. It's a question related to...
I didn't answer some of them before I forget.
Okay,
could you repeat the first question briefly?
Which one? The last one?
The very first one.
Oh yeah, the very first one. What policies or measures do you suggest to overcome the problem of structural heterogeneity in modern sectors?
Okay, move. Well, I expect you to come up with the answer for that one. But what we found, to some extent, is that generic policies in Latin America do not work very well, because the small firms at the lower end do not really use them. The utilization of policy instruments by the weaker firms is very, very limited for some reason. And I think we need to have a set of policies which specifically target the smaller, low productivity firms, which would also mean connecting them to the state-of-the-art firms which also exist, strengthening linkages between firms, strengthening subcontracting relationships, using, for instance, public procurement more than tax subsidies and tax credits, which don't work very well for small firms. They simply don't get to use them much. But it is a very difficult question, because you don't want too specific policies tailored to every different type of firms, which results in so much discretionary power that the policies will usually be undermined and corrupted. So it's a balance, but at the moment what we're doing doesn't seem to work very well. The differences seem to be increasing rather than decreasing, and I think we need to have a set of policies which specifically connects the smaller and weaker firms to the more state-of-the-art firms in the economy, so as to increase knowledge flows. It's an incomplete answer to a very relevant question, but that's what I can do at the moment. And then the second question?
Yes, Professor, the second question is about the regional dynamics affecting the possibilities of catching up for individual countries.
Yeah. Well, here we all know that agglomeration effects are hugely important. So that on the one hand, it really has advantages to have firms concentrated in certain regions, often coastal regions. The price you're paying then is regional inequality. And the Chinese have been rather good at shifting economic activities to their central regions, moving out of the coastal region to the central regions. Of course, they were supported by the fact that wages in the coastal regions were increasing very rapidly. So this is indeed a kind of regional flying geese effect, that as in places like Shanghai and Beijing, wages are soaring, the Chinese authorities move firms further inland where wages are still lower and there are still supplies of labor. And this, in a way, counteracts the tendency to regional inequality. And in China, we actually found in a paper that we did a couple of years ago with Lily Wang that you therefore have regional convergence. But there's sort of a trade-off between agglomeration effects, which I would argue call for regional inequality, and well, policies aimed at inland or more distant regions, which create more regional equality. What at the minimum you need to do is, when you shift activities to the less advanced region, is to do a lot at the same time, so that you at least have, again, some agglomeration effects also in more backward regions.
Thank you, Professor, for these two answers. We have a third question by Muid. It is a question related to the omega graphs. The classification of ability to escape the trap through the omega index graphs and showing the growth trajectory is very interesting. How do you classify the countries that went from low income to high income from 1950s to 1980s onwards in terms of their technological increase and labor increase? And there is also another question from him, but if you want to answer this one first.
Well, in order to answer this question, what we need to do is show maps for every single country. Every country has a unique path. And of course, some of the resource-intensive countries in the Middle East have a very specific path where their movement upwards on the income scale can actually be achieved with a small modern sector, a low share of people working in the modern sector, and a low level of technological capabilities in most of these sectors. And then the question is, what can you do to diversify your dependence on natural resources by increasing the size of the modern sector and investing the funds from primary exports into knowledge-intensive activities, so that you can also move. So some countries in the Gulf states are really trying to do this, but I would have to produce, I don't have them at hand at this moment, we could produce a graph for every single country and see what kind of trajectories they have. But I would assume, in answer to the question, that for many countries the modern sector is rather small, especially if we exclude government from the modern sector, and that the technological level of the non-resource sectors is, until recently, rather low. And again, there are exceptions of countries which are really deliberately trying to achieve progress on both dimensions, both the size and the reducing the technology gap.
Thank you, Professor. We have another question from Oid and two more questions, one from Enrique and the other one's from Jennifer. The second question from Oid is, as an example of these countries is the GCC economies, oil and gas rich countries of the Arabian Peninsula. Is it possible to visualize the growth trajectory using the same method?
Yes. So I thought I had already said that. We have several of those countries in our database. And again, I don't have the graphs. It would be wonderful if I could click on a slide and put them on. I don't have them at hand. But for each of the 124 countries in our sample, which definitely includes some of the Middle Eastern Gulf countries, you could chart exactly the trajectory, and it would help you pinpoint some of the problems that you have in economic transformation.
Professor, the question from Enrique is, hello Professor, would you say that part of these middle income traps are related to financial issues and lack of access to capital, which could limit the level of technological upgrading in the economy?
I don't think so. This is a question to which I don't have a very good answer. I do think that macroeconomic stability is an important issue, which has had very negative consequences for several countries, creating uncertain expectations. But it's not so much that there's a lack of funding. I mean, Mexico has a huge export surplus. Brazil profited hugely from a primary export boom. It's not money that was really the missing link or finance. Perhaps it is getting the finance to the firms, so the connection of financial institutions with certain types of firms, that could be a problem. But it also has to do with all the well-known problems of ease of doing business, red tape, not to speak of corruption, which in some countries really work as a disincentive. So my general gut feeling would be that no, it's not really finance as such which is the most important missing link, though of course improving financial institutions so that you could better get to the firms that need finance would be definitely part of the policy mix. For instance, improving also venture capital is one of the ways to promote more innovative behavior and have upgrading, technological upgrading on the horizontal axis. But that's it's a somewhat unsatisfactory question because, again, I do not really know, but my feeling is that finance is not the most important bottleneck.
Thank you, Professor. And the final question, we have a question from Jennifer Taborda. Professor Szirmai, it's a pleasure to hear from you. You stressed the role of wages and how their growth before catching up can erode the competitiveness of countries. But what do you think is the role of income inequality, in particular as unequal access to capital in many developing countries?
That's a very good question. It's quite well known that income inequality acts as a brake on the development of domestic markets. Again, the example that I would like to give is China, which is engaged in the past 5 to 8 years in a transition from dependence on export markets to dependence on the domestic economy. And where is that domestic economy coming from? It has to do with a huge increase of purchasing power among hundreds of millions of Chinese inhabitants. However, it is a little bit a mixed story because we also see that in the same time inequality in China has been increasing, not decreasing. So in some ways it has more to do with the decline of absolute poverty and the increase of incomes of the poor rather than distribution as such. Other things equal, I would say a more egalitarian distribution of income is good for domestic markets and creates opportunities for expansion of the modern sector and technological upgrading. In practice, it's not happening. In practice, in most countries that achieve very rapid catch-up, you see increasing inequality and in spite of that, successful economic growth. So the answer to the question is, in principle, it would be better. If you look at the empirics, I don't see many countries that have reduced inequality. And strangely enough, those countries that have reduced inequality, such as Brazil, have even experienced stagnation of their growth. So that's also a somewhat confusing picture.
Well, Professor, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I'd like to thank the audience as well for the interesting questions and relevant ones. And I would like to also thank the YSI working groups of Latin America and innovation that were helping me to promote this discussion in this webinar series. I will send you all the slides and the presentation as soon as we finish this webinar. And next week we won't have the webinar. We'll have only 15 days from now the last webinar from our session, which will be made by Professor Michiko Izuka about natural resources, innovation in natural resources industrialization. So Professor Szirmai, I'd like to thank you again for this very nice presentation, and thank you everyone.
Okay, thank you for attending, all of you, and good luck.